So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to this side event on human rights in Indonesia. My name is Peter Prove. I'm Director for International Affairs at the World Council of Churches, and we are delighted to partner with Franciscans International in organizing this event with the support of Amnesty International, Peace Brigades International, Human Rights Watch, Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, Christian Solidarity International, Civicus, and Geneva for Human Rights. Very grateful to all those partners who have worked with us to bring this event together. Obviously, this moment where we are having this conversation, we are very close to the one-year anniversary of the administration of President Prabowo Subianto, which began in October 2024. And in the meantime, most recently, we have observed a very alarming situation in Indonesia with the intense protests that have been taking place, especially in Jakarta, but in other parts of the country as well. We have noted with concern the hundreds of cases of arbitrary arrest that are reported, maybe as many as 3,000 cases, the statistics regarding death and injury of protesters. We are concerned about the overall situation at the national level in Indonesia in this context, but it has also a special relevance for us and our long-term work with regard to the situation in West Papua, where patterns of police repression, civic space restriction, violent crackdowns on protests and activists are unfortunately all too familiar to Indigenous Papuans who seek to advocate and to mobilize for their rights in that context. So we have speakers today that will address the wider issue at the national level, but also with a particular focus on the ongoing situation in West Papua. So I'm grateful to all the speakers. I will introduce them in the order in which they speak. And the first speaker will be Mr. Binoto Moy Damai, a member of MRIP, the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who is himself an indigenous Juma Tripuri from the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh. I think he'll be well known to many in this room, so I won't waste further time by introducing him. But I do want to let you know that unfortunately, due to other pressing obligations, he will have to leave us more or less immediately after he has shared his thoughts on the situation. So just to say thank you very much for carving out this time to speak to us today. The floor is yours, Mr. Binoto.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for the introductions, and thank you to the organizers, distinguished panelists, and also very good to see the Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous Peoples, Dr. Albert Barumed, in this panel. It's an honor to be with him here in the same panel. Yes, as Peter mentioned, unfortunately, I have to leave early for other commitment. Actually, in the middle of those of one of the activities I just gave, it was unpredictably happened. Apologize for this in advance. As I am introduced and here also as a member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and being from the Asia socio-cultural regions, my overview will reflect from the perspective of expert mechanisms and also at the same time how we can advance the Indigenous people's rights collectively, globally, and at the domestic context. So I'll share from my perspective as an MD member how we see this engagement. As you may know, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is created by the Human Rights Council, and its mandate was strengthened in 2016. It was started in 2008. MDIP is an advisory body of the Human Rights Council, mandate to provide expert advice to the Council through thematic studies and reports, particularly focusing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The mandate also provides assisting member states, Indigenous peoples organizations, and other entities upon request implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So when I talk about the assistance assisting to the member states or Indigenous peoples or other entities, it can take several forms. One is the advising on the development of domestic legislation and policies relating to the Indigenous people's rights. supporting states in implementing the recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review, treaty bodies, and other special procedures, facilitating dialogue between the states, indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders to achieve the ends of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So when I also talk about this assistance through the country engagement of MRIP, country engagement, we can do several issues engagement. One is the analyzing of domestic legislation and independent advice, facilitating dialogue, observation and advice on law and policy implementation, capacity building and awareness raising for rights holders, particularly for the indigenous peoples. Now turning to the point of the West Papua and the human rights issues. If we understand from our Asian context, we are 260 million out of 411 million indigenous peoples globally. That means 2/3 global indigenous peoples in the Asia region. This diversity makes the region crucial for the global indigenous peoples agenda. So in the perspective of this, I believe that here what I have just extended from the country engagement perspective, civil society organizations and other human rights organizations play a vital role in promoting the mandate of MRIPs through this country engagement, through the facilitating country engagement, using the National Human Rights Commission and ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights as the entry point to raise the voices of indigenous peoples, and also encouraging the UN bodies and other entities on this issue together. When I raise this country engagement and also the opportunity, this because if we see the Asian context, most of the Asian states don't recognize indigenous peoples in their constitutions, laws, or policies. Often governments either provide misinformation or refuse to engage on indigenous issues. So MRIP's country engagement could help clarify and interpret indigenous people's rights in line with international standards, including the issue you talk about always, the situation of West Papua. Now, even when formal country engagement requires government approval, autonomous bodies and UN entities can still invite MRIP for capacity building, interpretations, or dialogue facilitations. Where political sensitiveness prevents direct engagement, there are different unofficial avenues for MRIPs to contribute. As I mentioned, MRIP engaged through studies and advice with expertise. It had provided recommendations, various thematic studies and reports such as self-determination, militarizations, land rights of indigenous peoples, and we receive an overwhelming submission from the 7 sociocultural regions of indigenous peoples every time we call for contribution, including West Papua and other countries' human rights situation. MRIP next study is on indigenous people's rights in the conflict and post-conflict situation. The objective of this thematic study is to provide advice on how best can be addressed indigenous people's rights in line with the UN Declaration, Article 7.2, that talk about peace. So what we have always been looking forward is the constructive engagement and respectful partnership between state and indigenous peoples, and also in the case of Asia indigenous context, including this West Papua context as well. And this is because we would like to do this collective advancement of their rights with their respect and also the dignity. So in conclusion, I would like to thank once again the organizers and those who are here in these rooms for this sharing, for these discussions. And I believe that civil society organizations, yourself and other organizational platforms can be a bridge between MRIP, indigenous peoples, states and national and regional human rights mechanisms in different countries of the Asian regions. And through strengthened collaborations, we can advance the implementations, not only the UNDRI, but also other individual and collective human rights through various forums. So I will stop here. Thank you very much once again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Binota. And I think it's important that we hold on to what you have said about the service that MRIP can provide, in effect, to states to address issues pertaining to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we will have something more to say about that at the conclusion of this meeting. But we know that you must leave for your other important obligations. We thank you once again for being with us for the beginning of this discussion and for sharing your thoughts. Please.
Yeah, I apologize once again. Since I have to leave, I will request that whatever you have recommendations, can you please convey this message to us, to MRIP, and also in sending to the Secretariat? That will be helpful for us to navigate how to engage, effectively contribute to such kind of discussions, and also any other concerning issues that you might think useful for MRIP engagement. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Benota. The next speaker will be Mr. Wirya Adiwena, who is Deputy Director at Amnesty International Indonesia. Before joining Amnesty, Wirya served as Head of International Relations and a researcher at the Habibie Center, a prominent think tank in Jakarta. We're very grateful that you can be with us, Wirya, to maybe share the broader perspective as you see it from the position of Amnesty International in Jakarta, and also thoughts that you might share with us regarding the situation in West Papua specifically. Over to you.
Peter, and thank you as well to Benota for opening. And thank you as well for highlighting that Indonesia had recently seen quite a large-scale protest happening in Jakarta as well as other parts of Indonesia. Indeed, in the past weeks, Indonesia saw its citizens protested largely peacefully because of perceived social and economic injustice. They protested amidst budget cuts, rare, scarce, good and decent jobs for many of us, while at the same time they also saw an increased salary for members of parliaments, about almost 20 times above the basic minimum salary. They also saw a government that is quite bloated with 49 ministers, the largest in Indonesian history. The protests ran for quite a while. It did get heated, and in one night, a motorcycle taxi driver who was working, Afan Kurniawan, was trampled by an armored police vehicle, an armored police tactical vehicle. Enraged, disappointed, sad, Indonesian citizens continued to protest. What happened in the ensuing protest was about 4,000 Indonesians arrested arbitrarily. About 500 became victims of police violence, 300 among them victims of improper use of tear gas and water cannons. We saw 11 people died, 8 human rights defenders and others are criminalized and under detention. 2 people are yet to be found. This is a sad picture of what's been happening in Indonesia in the past several weeks. However, this is not new. Indeed, patterns of repressive use of violence, excessive use of violence, and criminalizations following large-scale protests in Indonesia has been happening for a while. In 2020, in 2022, 2024, or even this year in May 2025 during the May Day protests. Oftentimes, when there are large-scale protests or even large-scale gatherings, such as in Kanjuruhan in the football stadium, where police improperly used tear gas that ended with 135 people passing away, it is quite often that the police met the protests with improper use of tear gas, water cannons, and other use of less lethal weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, this issue had been raised by many of the special procedures. And it is quite often that the government of Indonesia responded to all of those communications, highlighting that the police, that the security apparatuses had reacted swiftly, professionally, and proportionally. while in fact, all of those things materialize in the forms of beatings, draggings, arbitrary arrests and detentions, often incommunicado for several days, the improper use of less lethal weapons, including against civilians, at times to schools, to train stations, to people who are not even involved in the protests, and verbal threats and intimidations, including verbal death threats and sexual violence against protesters. This is not new. This has been going on for a while in a country that often positions itself as a democratic country, as one of the largest democracy in the region. This also follows a trend in which we saw a normalization of military presence in civilian affairs. Indeed, earlier this year, we saw the passings of the army law that legalized military presence in a number of public and civilian ministries, including public health and the narcotics institution as well. Now, all of this trend that has been happening nationally, sadly, is something that has been going on for a longer period of time in West Papua. And so, to conclude, as we see the deteriorations of the quality of civic space and the protections of human rights in Indonesia nationally, and as I hope we pay closer attention to what's happening in Indonesia nationally, we are also paying equally close, if not closer attention to what's happening in West Papua. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wiria, for sharing this overall perspective and the concerns that Amnesty International in Indonesia has highlighted in the context of the recent protests, but also recognizing the much longer term challenge of a similar nature that has been experienced by the Indigenous Papuan people in West Papua. So now we move, apropos of that, to the next speaker, who is Ms. Defe Wabisa, who is an Indigenous Papuan youth environmental rights defender, working with Pusaka, an organization defending Indigenous peoples' rights and environmental justice in Papua, and in particular, with and for communities living near plantations. Pusaka is currently accompanying communities in the south of Papua, whose homes and livelihoods are at risk from a national project which would see the destruction of 2 million hectares of forest to make way for sugarcane plantation and rice fields. Very pleased that you could be with us here, Defe, to represent your community. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Last year, we sent a letter using the special procedure mechanism to the UN about what happened in Merauke. For July 2025, 2 months ago, we found out that 2 sugarcane companies and also 1 rice field company already doing the land clearing for more than 19,000 hectares to the area that owned by 4 tribes in Merauke. 9 special rapporteurs responded to this case, and they sent a letter to Indonesian government and also one of the sugarcane companies. They stating their concern regarding the rights to food, about women, and where the indigenous people will go, and also the global implications from this project. The government also responded to the letters, and one of the main arguments was, since the community in Merauke is not a community that's recognized by Indonesian regulations, or in this case, they are not masyarakat hukum adat, it's still legal for these companies to do the land clearing. These arguments contradict the super slow actions in passing the Indigenous Peoples Bill. They use the argument, but then it is very hard for us with the communities to get the recognition from the local government or from the national level. In Papua, there are more than 250 tribes and only 7 territories that are recognized currently, and it's in the area near the city. The process in getting the recognition is super slow, but it is very easy for these companies to get their permits. For this specific case, 10 sugarcane companies in Merauke, 1 big rice field project, 5 nickel companies in Raja Ampat, 7 palm plantations side by sides in Bovendigul, and also timber companies in Sorong, Jayapura, and many more, alongside big companies such as Freeport and British Petroleum. What about the people? These extractive activities and massive deforestation cut people access to their integrated connection with the forest. Melanesian people known as someone who lives closely with the forest. This deforestation cut down their access to their indigenous food. A lot of sagu trees were cutting down and changed it into the rice fields. We didn't eat sagu. We didn't eat rice. We eat sagu. And gastrocolonialism happened. If you went to Merauke, you will find the communities they are changing. Their body's characteristics are changing because they have to change their food pattern. And it also cut down their relationship to their ancestors through their sacred places. And the most important one, the legacy and to the future generations. You know, a sagu tree will, the process of the whole sagu tree, it grows for 10 years. So when a mother plant a sagu tree, it will be for her children or the next generation. And they cut it down. So it's indirectly cut down the whole relationship from a generation to the next generations. And it affects my generation as well and my children's. So currently, there are indigenous representatives that affected with the National Strategic Project, not only in Papua, but also in Indonesia, asking the government to evaluating this regulation regarding the National Strategic Project at the national level. It's on the trial process right now. We hope that the Indonesian government can see this issue, that this is not only specific case in Papua, but also affect everyone who lives closely with environment, and evaluate the National Strategic Project from Indonesian Omnibus Law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Defe. If I may, I would like to highlight again a point that Defe has made about the closeness of Indigenous peoples' livelihoods and lifestyles and rights, the closeness of those values with the protection of the rainforest. I also like to highlight the fact that Indonesia is one of the 5 countries with the largest remaining reserves of virgin rainforest, which is particularly threatened in a context like West Papua, where there is so little oversight and so little access to determine what is happening, what are the impacts upon this global asset, the lungs of the planet, and of course, its immediate and concrete impacts on Indigenous peoples in West Papua. Thank you very much, Defe. So then we move to the final speaker, and we're honored that we were able to be joined by Dr. Albert Barume, who was, of course, appointed as Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in December 2024. He has over 25 years of experience working on Indigenous peoples' rights at national, regional, and international levels. A national of the DRC, Dr. Barume was among the first lawyers to work to take up the challenge of addressing Indigenous peoples' rights in Africa from the 1990s. Dr. Barume, we're very pleased that you could join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for being so generous with your presentation. And thank you for inviting me to this important event. I want to start by thanking the organizer, obviously, for giving me this opportunity to expand on an issue and a country that I unofficially visited recently. I visited Indonesia in July this year, and I take this opportunity to thank the government of Indonesia for the time and allowing me to go through the country. I went all the way to West Papua and to other quite remote area. You allow me that I met different stakeholders in Indonesia. I was invited by a platform of indigenous people organizations, which was holding what they called human rights dialogues, to which they invited me. So it was an opportunity for me, as a new special rapporteur, to have a sense of the region, but also more specifically of what was going on in Indonesia as an important country in the Asian region. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get into the substance of my discussions for technical reasons. I'm still engaging the Indonesian government on my, I wouldn't call them findings, but I'll call them maybe on what I was able to listen to and to hear. And one of those issues that really came through those human rights dialogues, and the only maybe issue I can share with you, was the overall lack of recognition of indigenous peoples. And it coincided that as a special rapporteur who was appointed in December and started his mandate in January, I decided to write my first reports to the Human Rights Council on recognition. And it was good coincidence because throughout those dialogues, those community said they were indeed suffering from not being recognized as indigenous peoples, because it is indeed impossible for a state to deliver on those international obligations if they do not recognize the right holders. You can't deliver on a rights or on rights if you cannot precisely identify those right holders. And I took that as a first duty to deliver on as a special rapporteur, because before I became a special rapporteur for the UN, I did almost the same work for the African Union. And it was during my term with the African Union that the region was able to conceptualize or to Africanize or to contextualize the concept indigenous peoples. And I really, let me again thank the Indonesian government, because one of those governments that substantively contributed to my study, which I will be presenting to the council tomorrow. And let me just give you a glimpse of one of the points I'm putting in that report. Most specifically, really intended for Asian and African states, because they are the two regions in which states are grappling with understanding and therefore being unable to deliver on their international obligation regarding the declaration, because they are technically confusing indigenous as in the dictionary and indigenous peoples. These are two different concepts. Every time we talk about indigenous peoples, most states in Africa and Asia, they think we're talking about being born on a land and being a native of a land, or being first on a land. And it really confuses. So they argue that the concept would divide the nation, would undermine national cohesion, simply because they understand it as defined in a dictionary. That's not what we are talking about. We are talking about the human right concept, which is indigenous peoples in the UN Declaration. When a community self-identify as indigenous people, it is actually implicitly making a call for redress of something very specific. It is a specific violation grounded in historical injustices whereby certain communities were forced or continue to be forced to abandon their culture and way of life, which are seen as uncivilized, as a little bit savage, as not aligned with modern life. In post-colonial Asia and Africa, those communities have been since then being forced to get into the dominant way of life. That very specific violation is very pernicious because it creates an intergenerational trauma, as I write in my report. Children of those communities are told that they belong to a savage tribe, that they are not as intelligent as other kids, that their culture, their language, their way of life is something demeanable. And on a daily basis, they are demeaned. So that violation kills something very profound in every single one of us, the self-esteem of being human being. It does indeed almost dehumanize. So it's a very specific violation. And when you have that in mind, and then you scan Asia, and Africa, you can conclude it's not a violation that affects everyone. Because this is not poverty. It is not just people without access to school, to education. It is something very pernicious that dehumanizes the victim. There is no, that's my last point. There is no other legal regime under international law that is devised to correct that very specific violation. This is what I think, and in my view, in Africa, when a number of states could understand what is specific about that violation, they did indeed realize it wasn't fair, and they did take measures. So I really hope that in those two regions, there can be, and I believe there will be, states that can simply see that indigenous people legal regime, it contributes to equality. Actually, it enhances national cohesion, and it really created a national context whereby no one is left behind, including in national developments. I'm looking forward to engaging with the Indonesian government on my findings through the proper procedures. And again, I do appreciate this invitation. I wish the administrative hurdle had been passed so that I could share with you what I will be engaging the Indonesian government on. But let me close my short intervention by saying this. There are, in my view, in Asia and Africa, including in Indonesia, element of a willingness for a state to address that specific injustices that I've just underlined. And I'm hoping that the report on recognition can ease or help the states understand better what indigenous people's rights are all about, which is equality, and non-discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burume, and really thank you for your commitment and your engagement in addressing this issue and your open invitation or your open offer of collaboration, cooperation with the government of Indonesia in helping to address some of these issues. Because indeed you highlight a really fundamental issue, and it was alluded to also in Defe's presentation, about the fact that still today the government of Indonesia does not fully recognize the concept of indigenous peoples to the standard of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and indeed that a specific bill that would address these issues, that would provide for recognition, has been stalled in Parliament for over a decade. And I think from our point of view, this has been on the basis of argumentation that is largely semantic in nature rather than substantive. So I do hope that with your cooperation, through your cooperation with the government of Indonesia, that we can overcome these semantic hurdles and finally provide for a proper and real and substantive recognition of indigenous peoples in Indonesia and, of course, very specifically in the case of West Papua. I want to, by way of, before opening the floor, I want to just summarize a few points that seem important to me. One is, of course, this issue of recognition of indigenous peoples, which we've just spoken about, and I do think that that's fundamental. But it speaks to a larger question, and it's an invitation that we've issued to the Indonesian government at every such public event and in many other private conversations about our desire for the government of Indonesia to engage openly with the international community in addressing these issues, providing for transparency, providing for access, and utilizing the expertise and the capacities that reside in such individuals and such mandates as the mandate that Dr. Burume holds, that MRIP holds, to utilize these assets in order to work through these problems, and in general, to provide much more transparency and openness with regard to the situation in West Papua in particular. And that brings me to my second point, because we've spoken about the wider national context and the human rights concerns that have been raised in the context of the recent unrest and response by the governmental and security authorities in places like Jakarta and elsewhere. This has been very visible. This has been clear in the international media. Compare that with the situation in West Papua, where similar sorts of violations have been endemic for decades, but which is entirely invisible to the international community. And that is not by accident, it is by design, in my opinion. So there needs to be more openness and more transparency, specifically with regard to the situation in West Papua. And then finally, to emphasize again a point that I made earlier about the intimate connection between environmental protection, and specifically of the rainforest, and the West Papuan indigenous people and communities, that these things are inherently and inextricably linked. And in this regard, a national strategic project like that which is proposed in the southern part of Papua, affecting communities around Merauke, is absolutely not in the interests of the indigenous Papuan people. It's in the interests of others. And I think that there needs to be a clear separation between the human rights and clear recognition of the difference between the human rights of the indigenous peoples of West Papua, or people in general in Indonesia, and the rights and entitlements and advantages given to specific individuals, specific companies, and often multinational companies. So those are my takeaways from this discussion, and I offer them back to you. And with that, I open the floor for comments, questions, discussion. And I do so first by offering the floor to the representative of the Permanent Mission of Indonesia. Please, sir.
Rapporteur, Mr. Peter Proof, and distinguished panel colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you for allowing our delegation to respond to the presentations of the panelists. We have a brief 3 key points in response to the presentation. First, in relation to the recent mass protests in several provinces, Let me emphasize that President Prabowo and his cabinet continue to keep their doors open to the aspirations of the people. For example, the president has publicly acknowledged studying the popular 17+8 proposal raised by students and think tanks. This reflects the government's respect for democracy and commitment to bringing the voices of the people, especially the youth, into national policy. Second, Indonesia remains committed to protecting the freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. In a vibrant democracy like ours, peaceful demonstrations are part of daily life and are never hindered. We are, of course, fully aware of concerns regarding excessive use of force by security personnel, both during protests and broader contexts. However, at the same time, as a state party to the ICCPR, Indonesia is obliged to safeguard national security and public order. Acts of violence, looting, and arson against public property cannot be tolerated. President Prabowo has been clear. There is no room for intimidation, criminalization, or unlawful force against citizens, including those exercising their rights to express aspirations. Investigations and legal proceedings have been launched into cases of excessive force, and preparations are underway to establish a commission to lay the foundation for long-term policy reform. Moreover, President Prabowo has urged all branches of government to remain responsive to demands for change. The Parliament has acted promptly, including revoking benefits for its members deemed contrary to the public interest. On the issue of alleged arbitrary arrests during the protests, the government stresses that arrests were carried out in line with the law and due process, as protests escalated in riots involving vandalism, looting, and the threats to public safety, resulting in fatalities and damage to facilities. The majority of detainees have since been released, and those still in custody are guaranteed full protection of their rights and a fair legal process. Third, regarding the protection of the rights of masyarakat hukum adat or customary law communities, especially related to national strategic projects or NSP, we need to stress that the Merauke NSP or other projects in Papua or other provinces in Indonesia have been implemented in accordance with regulations, particularly on land use and spatial planning within a designated production forest area in the provinces. State agencies and companies involved in the project are required to consult with local communities as a prerequisite for obtaining cultivation rights, ensuring local concerns and rights are respected. For instance, the regional spatial planning document in Papua was also drafted by involving the Papuan Council of Customary Communities to ensure accommodation of customary areas and specific needs of the customary law communities. Land designations for commercial or agricultural legal frameworks. Despite challenges, NSPs and other projects in Papua and other provinces in Indonesia are vital, given their significant economic and social impact. A University of Indonesia study found these projects contributed for more than 1,600 trillion rupiah to economic output and created 4.5 million jobs. On a broader context, efforts are also underway to strengthen the registration of customary lands, forests, and coasts to ensure recognition and protection of customary territories. For example, from 2016 to 2025, 160 units of forest across 19 provinces, covering nearly 400,000 hectares, have been designated as hutan adat or customary forests, benefiting some 83,000 households. We recognize that a comprehensive legal framework for customary law communities is essential. We remain hopeful that the bill on customary law communities will be passed during President Prabowo's term, ensuring robust legal protection of their constitutional rights. In conclusion, despite challenges, the current administration is working tirelessly to protect and improve the welfare of the people. We are equally committed to strengthening the rule of law, including in the environmental sector. We remain firm in addressing corruption, abuse, and violations, and will continue to deliver strong measures against illegal practices that cause loss of national revenue and harm to citizens. We also take note of the Special Rapporteur's presentation. However, we are in a position where, for us, the term Indigenous Peoples, as you explained, simply cannot be applied in more than just semantic hurdles, simply due to our country's unique history of colonialism and anthropological context. I thank you.
of Indonesia. I have seen a request for the floor at the back of the room. Please, sir.
Sharaf Azizov, GPTI. Thank you for the opportunity to raise a question. Indigenous peoples, including West Papua people, who possess a distinct language, culture, and clearly defined territory, are often recognized positively as vital contributors to international law and the human rights framework. Yet, when such people seek recognition under the United Nations list of non-self-governed territories, under UN resolutions 1514 and 1541, the path forward appears extremely challenging. Could you elaborate on why it is so difficult for indigenous peoples with these defining elements of distinct peoplehood to be recognized within the current United Nations decolonization framework? And what concrete steps remain available for the people of West Papua to pursue recognition in the list of the non-self-governed territories? Furthermore, what role can the Special Rapporteur play in facilitating this process? Thank you.
I think I will first give an opportunity to Dr. Barume to respond if he would wish. Otherwise, I think either of the other two panelists could have something to say on this point. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me put it in a different way. And as I said, the indigenous people's legal regime under international law is relatively new. It's relatively new. It's a specific legal regime that seeks to address specific human rights violations, which I did underline. Indigenous peoples suffer from something similar with other groups. But what really makes the uniqueness of their claim is what I have underlined. It's a land dispossession grounded in racial discrimination and historical injustices, whereby peoples, nations, entities that recognize as peoples are denied to continue to culturally exist as such within nation states. That's the indigenous people legal regime. You would find correlations between indigenous people and minority regime. And now in my report, I do also address the current confusion between indigenous people and local communities, indigenous people and other groups. It's really, really important, and it's the reason of my report that states do not confuse indigenous people's regime with other regimes, because it makes invisible the specific human right violation that dehumanizes entire communities and nations. So there is a clear distinction between those different regimes, and it's really important for states not to confuse them, including for other stakeholders. That's the only comment I can put on that. Thank you.
Dr. Barume, I don't know if other panelists would like to speak to this issue. What I could say is that, of course, there have been historical efforts along the trajectory that you are referring to, but that is not the conversation we are having here. The conversation we're having here is about the human rights of the West Papuan indigenous people and the Indonesian government's responsibility to that community and to members thereof. So it's an interesting issue that you've raised, but it's not the topic that we are presenting and discussing. And it's not the trajectory that we're pursuing. We look to the government of Indonesia to be responsible and to be accountable and to be correct in recognition of the indigenous people within Indonesia and in protection of their rights and livelihoods. Are there other questions that anybody would like to put? I'm looking at the time. We have 5 minutes. We could take maybe another 2 or 3 minutes before we have to leave the room. If there are other pressing questions, I could entertain them now. If there are not, then I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists who remain on the panel for their excellent presentations and for their extraordinary discipline in keeping to time. Thank you so much.